We've now finished working our way through the Torah, right? We read large chunks of Genesis, large chunks of Exodus, and scattered bits and pieces from Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We've spoken about the various sources, the narratives, the laws. We've more or less, I think, done due diligence on the Torah. We haven't read the whole thing, but we've gotten a good sense of the whole thing, I hope, if you've done the readings. So today is the last session in which we're going to reflect on the Torah. And starting on Monday, we'll be looking at the book of Joshua and moving ahead. So today's theme is God, a theme which is everywhere in all the sessions we've been looking at, and yet we haven't actually sat down and just reflected on what the Torah says about God, or how it presents God as a character in the story. That's what we're doing today. So, to begin, who is Israel's God? Well, of course, you know from the modern Bible scholars, we make a distinction between, we pay a lot of attention to the different names of God that are used. So the first name that we find in Genesis chapter 1, in fact, the third word of the Torah, is God, and the Hebrew word is Elohim. Elohim is a plural form. If you know Hebrew, then Elohim looks like a plural noun. It's a plural noun, but it is a singular noun. That is to say, it governs singular verbs. It gets singular adjectives. So it's grammatically singular, even though the form, the form of the word looks like it's plural. That word we translate God. In your Bible translations, in the beginning God created, or when, God began, Right, so God is our standard translation for Elohim. It seems to be a plural of Eloah, which would seem to be the singular form, which appears sometimes in the Hebrew Bible, usually in poetical form, in poetical context. And in turn, it seems to be a variant on the form El, on the name El, E-L, which is found all over the place in the ancient Near East as a name for a god or a name for a specific god. So that is El, or that is Elohim. Elohim sometimes is used in the plural, both in the Torah and elsewhere. And when it is, it does get plural adjectives or plural verb. And usually when it does that, we translate it gods, small case G-O-D-S. Some of these are tricky, trying to figure out what exactly the passage means, but there are these passages where Elohim is plural and means gods, most famously in the Ten Commandments. You shall have no other gods before me. Elohim acherim al panai. So there, clearly it means gods, right? Can't mean anything else. Some other passages we can argue whether it means gods or it means God. By the way, our convention that when we're talking about God, we have a capital G, and we're talking about other gods, we put a lowercase g. So Zeus and Apollo and Marduk and Ra all get lowercase g God because we don't believe in those gods, whereas the Judeo-Christian God, if I may use that term, gets an Islamic God, right, gets a capital G God. I don't know the whole history of that convention. Anybody know the history of that convention? That, of course, is not ancient, because ancients do not have capital letters. Hebrew does not have capital letters to this very day. Okay? And most ancient Greek manuscripts don't have capital letters either. So, what? Well, they have only capital letters. Thank you. Some of them are only capital letters. Some of them are only minor, lowercase letters. Okay? So anybody know? I'm just curious. This idea popped into my head. Where and when does this convention come from? Don't know, but it's not ancient. Okay, right. So that's the problem. So God or gods, it's the same word, looks the same. You can't tell, and you have to figure out from context what you're talking about. Okay. Last point there, when the Bible is trying to talk about God in a generic, universal sense, it usually uses Elohim. In other words, all the nations of the world can worship Elohim. Elohim can demand justice from all the nations of the world. Elohim sets up a moral code, a universal moral code for everyone, and everyone is expected to follow that universal moral code. You see that all over the place in wisdom literature. Remember wisdom literature? I gave you a brief introduction to it. We talk about Deuteronomy, but we're going to have a session coming up on it in a few weeks. So just hold on to this. So wisdom literature is literature in the Hebrew Bible, most famously the book of Proverbs, the book of Job, and the book of Ecclesiastes. These are examples of wisdom literature. They almost always and only use the name Elohim. And I would translate it in these books, the deity. It's not Israelite, it's just God in the abstract, in the absolute sense. So that can mean that too. So I count up at least 3 different meanings, translations of the word Elohim. Elohim means God of Israel. Elohim means deity, the deity, leaving out its Israelite aspect. Or 3, Elohim can mean gods. In our convention, we would say lowercase g. Okay. Then we turn, that's chapter 1. That's the priestly account of the creation, you recall. Genesis chapter 1. Modern Bible scholars think it's P. So P is using Elohim as the name for God. But you get to chapter 2, all of a sudden you see something new in Genesis. You see the second creation account uses the particular name of God, YHWH, and I'll talk about that in 1 second, sometimes by itself or in combination with Yahweh, YHWH plus Elohim mixed together. YHWH is the name called the Tetragrammaton because it's tetra, 4 grammaton letters, so the divine name of 4 letters. And the YHWH is usually translated Lord. Why is it translated Lord? It's translated Lord because ancient Jews, ancient Israelites, and following them, ancient Jews, and following them, medieval and modern Jews, right, don't want to say the name YHWH. Why? Because that is bearing the name of God in vain. We are afraid of desecration. Frankly, I think the real issue is magic and superstition, right? You know, this name will zap, is electric. This name will zap you if you say it just right or if you say it just wrong. So you're better off not saying it. Right. So the result was already in ancient times already, when Jews saw the name YHWH, these are I'm anglicizing the Hebrew letters, of course, YHWH. When they saw that, they didn't pronounce it. They said instead the Hebrew word Adonai, which means Lord. And then when the Greek translators got to the Hebrew Bible, they saw YHWH, and they translated it also as Lord, but the word they used was kurios, which is the Greek word for Lord or Master, right? And that is why Jesus Christ is always known as Lord. Well, actually, there are several more steps in that logic. But, okay, many Christian prayers notably say Kyrie eleison, those who are Christians, those who listen to Mozart and requiems online and so on. So Kyrie eleison. Kyrie means is the vocative for Lord. In other words, we're addressing the Lord. Kyrie, Lord. Eleison, have pity, have mercy. So we get from YHWH to Adonai, to Lord, or to Kurios, and then to Lord. And then for Christians, Kurios is the special title for Christ. Letters. You also find in many Qumran scrolls of the Torah that they're writing the scroll in regular Hebrew script, but when they get to the name YHWH, they use the old script. Our unfamiliar Hebrew script. In other words, this name is powerful and potent, and when you get to it, it's danger. Flashing red lights. Be careful. So a 19th century German scholar, right, asked himself, well, what's the real pronunciation of this mysterious YHWH? Right? He came up with the transliteration of, I'm going to say it now, Yahweh, which either is or is not the correct pronunciation of that name, because we don't know the correct pronunciation of that name. That's, if it follows certain grammatical rules, then that's what the pronunciation would have been. And it would have meant then he who brings into being, or he is the source of being, or the how do you say, being an intransitive verb. He that makes things come into being. But as I said, from a very ancient times, no one pronounced the name, so consequently it's conjectural how to pronounce it. The pronunciation Jehovah, as you know, is completely in error. I know for sure it was not pronounced Jehovah. This I'm absolutely sure. However it was pronounced, I'm not sure. But this I do know. It was not pronounced Jehovah because Jehovah represents a combination of an X and a Y. Combining the letters YHWH, the V is the same as the W, the V and the W. And the J is the same as the Y. So the consonant, the letters, YHWH, but taking the vowels of the word Elohim and attaching them to the name of God, YHWH, and then you wind up with Jehovah. So I'm not objecting to Jehovah's Witnesses. That's fine. They're beautiful, wonderful people. I have no problem. But I'm simply commenting as a philologist and a historian, Jehovah is not the original pronunciation of the name. Okay, let's get to the heart of the matter. YHWH, as far as we know, seems to be the quintessentially Israelite name of God. Elohim shares all those connections with the ancient Near East, as I mentioned, but YHWH seems to be Israelite. Now, we're going to get to in just a minute or two where this God comes from, but as far as we have it, YHWH is found in Israelite literature, the Hebrew Bible, Israelite contexts, and in archaeologically speaking, also either in or immediately adjacent to the settlements of the ancient Israelites. So this seems to be an Israelite name of God. Whether the name and the God come from somewhere else, I'll come back to very shortly. We have some other names that I'm not going to talk about. El, I mentioned already. El Shaddai is another name that appears a couple times. El Elyon, the highest God, I guess we translate El Elyon, or supermost, supreme God, something like that, would be El Elyon. Then a whole bunch of phrases like God of the fathers, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, God of your fathers, God of my fathers, right? A whole series of phrases such as these. So what do we do with all this? If you are a traditionalist, by that I mean a Jew or a Christian, then for you, all these interesting names, Elohim, YHWH, YHWH-Elohim, El Shaddai, all these names, they're all one and the same thing, if you are a traditionalist. It means God, capital G. Why then does God walk around with a wallet full of credit cards with different names on it? Because I know, because if you are a traditionalist, the different name of God reflects different aspects of God. So one's the merciful aspect, one's the judicial aspect, or the stern aspect. One is the aspect of God as a God of nature. You can make up all kinds of things, right? And they did. So depending upon the aspect of God that is at play in any given verse, that's the name that would be used. And in some passages, we have to admit, this exegesis works very well. Some passages. If you are a modern Bible scholar, then when you see different names for the same thing, you know right away there is a suture. There's stitching at work. Somebody is trying to combine various things and pretend they're all the same, but we modern Bible scholars know better. These were once different gods. These come from different places, different schools, north, south, east, west. This was not originally Israelite. It's Israelite. It's been assimilated into Israel. You can make up all kinds of things, right? Or the most obvious one we've already discussed several times here, different sources. One strand in the Bible likes this name of God, the other strand likes that name of God, until at some point some mysterious redactor came and stitched them together. But the seam is still apparent for all to see in these different names. So, according to modern Bible scholars, YHWH arrives in ancient Israel at a certain point, and from that point onward, YHWH becomes an ancient Israelite god. But YHWH was not always the Israelite god, because you have these other names and other ways of describing that god. So where and when, according to modern Bible scholars, I repeat, not, needless to say, traditionalists, comma. So according to modern Bible scholars, where, when, how, and whence does YHWH arrive on the scene? So first of all, the first piece of evidence modern Bible scholars point to for the newness of YHWH, evidence that YHWH was not there one day and is there the next day, are two key passages in the book of Exodus. And I transcribed the text for you on your handout. These are readings that are part of the assignment in the syllabus. Exodus chapter 3. This is Moses at the burning bush. Moses is now being commissioned by God, just as the many prophets get commissioning scenes. We have that. Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Isaiah have commissioning scenes. Here Moses is being commissioned as chief. He's going to be the chief man, the main man, to get the Israelites out of Egypt. That's what's going on. So Moses says to God, when I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? Very odd passage. And then it continues. And God said to Moses, trying to sound mysterious, right? Or in the movie The Ten Commandments, I am that I am. Right, you need a proper kind of voice with special effects, right, to kind of capture it. He continued, thus shall you say to the Israelites, sent me to you. And God said further, thus shall you speak to the Israelites, the Lord, YHWH, God of your fathers, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has sent me to you. If you are a modern Bible scholar, you look at this passage and you say, I see a seam right in front of me. It's very clear that somebody is trying to combine this notion of YHWH, here given the etymology of which seems to be a different form of the same verb from that same root, meaning I shall be. I am the existing one. Shaye, I am that I am, or something like that. And not referring to a casual fault. That's a different story. Right. You don't know what I'm talking about. Okay, never mind. So I am that I am. So it seems that the narrator is trying to explain to you what this name YHWH is, and here's a moment where Moses now gets the truth, to understand that that God is the same as the God of the fathers from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the two are now being blended into one. A similar kind of idea you find in Exodus chapter 6, where Moses' work is already underway to try to get the Israelites out of Egypt. God spoke to Moses and said, I am the Lord, YHWH. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name, YHWH. Here then, one of our biblical sources apparently thinks that in the book of Genesis you won't find YHWH, you'll only find El or El Shaddai. But is now telling you that henceforth I'm going to use the name YHWH. Our book of Genesis is chock full of references to YHWH. Answer, if you're a modern Bible scholar, different source. Simple. So, P and E use Elohim in the book of Genesis, but J uses YHWH. So J did not write this verse in the book of Exodus. That's how modern Bible scholars think. Now, if you are a traditionalist, what do you say? Did traditionalists, Jews and Christians, notice that there are different names of God in the text? They certainly noticed it. Did they notice that these verses seem to be very challenging? Yep, they noticed. Modern Bible scholars haven't found anything which was not known long since to traditionalists. The question is, how do you read it? And how do you understand the implications of it? For modern Bible scholars, this is clear evidence of seams, where one source doesn't quite agree with another on how to present the portrait of Israel's God. For traditionalists, no, we go back to the point of the Lord says, I did not make my character, YHWH, manifest to them, because I had not yet redeemed them. I had not yet fulfilled my promise. insofar as the Lord fulfills the promise. That's the aspect represented by the name YHWH. And that they had not yet seen. Because now I'm about to show it to you and to them by bringing you out of Egypt. All right, that either is or is not a satisfactory interpretation, but that's how traditionalists would explain this verse. But for modern Bible scholars, it's clear evidence that the ancient Israelites themselves have some dim memory that once upon a time, God was not YHWH. There is, in fact, a marriage going on at a certain moment where YHWH is then identified with the God of the fathers. So, if this be true, then I ask my question again. Whence does this God come? Or, who is this God? So if you're a modern Bible scholar, at least this is discussed by Kugel, YHWH is a warrior God who comes to Israel from the deserts of the south. Probably Midian, one of the neighboring tribes. And evidence for this comes from various poetical passages in the Bible where the Bible seems to say, flat out, that God is arriving from Midian, or God is arriving from the south. And I gave you two of the main pieces of evidence on your handout, on the lecture notes. So Deuteronomy 33:2. The Lord came from Sinai. He shone upon them from Seir. Seir is another name for Edom, which is another tribe in the south, in the desert regions. He appeared from Mount Paran and approached from riverboat Kodesh, wherever that is. I can't tell you where that one is. Lightning flashing at them from his right hand. Footnote, meaning of Hebrew uncertain. Lamo, no idea what to do with that. But here we seem to have a description of Sinai experience. Remember all the lightning and thunder and the flash, the light and sound show, right, at Mount Sinai? So here we are said that God arrives, as it were, on here from Sinai, from Seir, from Mount Paran, out in those desert regions. That's where Mount Sinai is, or Chorev. It's out in the southern desert. Well, that's where the God apparently used to hang out until God came from there to Israel. One verse. The other verse is from Habakkuk. Habakkuk. What is Habakkuk? Habakkuk is one of those mysterious and much neglected minor prophets in the scroll called the 12 prophets, the 12 minor prophets. Minor not qualitatively, heaven forbid. Minor simply in quantity. They're short. So you can get 12 of them onto one scroll. Isaiah takes up a whole scroll by himself. But here you get 12 into one scroll. So they're called the 12 minor prophets, and Habakkuk is one of them. So he has a description of a divine epiphany in chapter 3. Epiphany, God is making manifest. God is displaying his power and his presence in chapter 3. This is another extremely difficult passage from the point of view of translation. I'm sure Hebrew Bible PhD students would not want to get this passage on an exam, right? But here it is. God is coming from Teman. Eloah mi Teman yavo. The holy, there it says God. It's Eloah. The Holy One from Mount Paran. Sela, whatever Sela means, we don't know. His majesty covers the sky, splendor fills the earth, a brilliant light, blah, blah, blah. Glory, blah, blah, pestilence, plague, blah, blah, blah. It makes the earth shake, while nations tremble, blah, blah, blah. They're singing low. Tents of scene of havoc, tents of Cushan, land of Midian. He's from Teman. Teman, at least in modern Hebrew, means Yemen, but Teman just means the south. So here again is description. Apparently this God is this mighty warrior God full of sound and light, sound and fury, right, coming from the deserts of the south to Israel where he now abides. So if you're a modern Bible scholar, you put it all together, we recognize that the Hebrew Bible itself preserves evidence of a memory that this God was once not our God, or wasn't called this. It was called something else until YHWH arrives from the deserts of the south. Enters and then is blended with, becomes identified with our traditional names of God. El, God of the fathers, and so on. Okay, I'm not sure whether anything I just said is correct. I'm sure it's correct in the sense that I believe I've accurately presented the discussion in Kugel with some elaborations on how modern Bible scholars put things together. Do we know this for certain that this is true? Is this for certain historical? What's the answer, class? No, you should have figured this out by now. This is one of the themes in this class, right? These are all conjectures, hypotheses, possibilities. But smoking guns we don't got. Or in this case, smoking mountains, right? We don't have. So again, we're stuck with how you interpret these ambiguous passages. And then you've got the specific passages here about God coming from the south. I'd point out these are all from biblical poetry. And I had the same problem with these that I have with, remember those passages we looked at about God destroying the sea monster or Rahab in creation? Yeah, that's what it says. So can I deduce from that there was once upon a time Israelite theology about God and the monsters, which is then suppressed by the version we have in Genesis chapter 1? Answer, maybe. Other answer, it's poetry. Give me a break. They're not passing this off as a piece of theology. It's not a theological tract. It's poetry. Who takes poetry literally? Answer, modern Bible scholars. Okay, but back. Right. Who takes poetry literally? We don't take poetry literally. Why all of a sudden are we taking this so literally? I don't understand it. So it's a poet using imagery. Yeah, sure, imagery. Yeah. Okay. I have no problem with that. It's imagery. Let's think about that. And then I would have pointed out, too, that we also have other poems in the Bible which associate God not with the south and the desert, but with the north. And the clearest example of that, this is not discussed in Kugel, don't know why, is Psalm 29. Where Psalm 29 uses imagery which clearly locates YHWH, not in the south, in the desert, but in the north, in Lebanon, where the cedars are. Remember cedars of Lebanon? Right, the Lebanese national flag to this very day has cedar on it. Right, famous for its mighty and wonderful cedar trees. So here is Psalm 29. Ascribe to the Lord, you divine beings, literally sons of gods, if that's the right translation. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength, blah, 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 majestic, holy, blah, 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 over the waters, glory thunders, right, the Lord of the power, the Lord is majesty, Lord, blah, blah, blah. He makes Lebanon, blah, blah, he shatters the cedars of Lebanon. And all modern Bible scholars notice that Psalm 29 seems to be chock full of imagery and language and metaphors that come straight out of Ugaritic poetry, which is poetry from the Semitic language a couple kilometers up the road. So do I deduce, therefore, that YHWH came from Lebanon into Israel? I would say, of course not. The poet is singing the might of the power of God using imagery derived from northern poems, just as he's able to sing of the might of God from imagery from southern poems. I'm not advancing a thesis class. I'm simply showing you how tentative all of this is. What is this God like, and how does God relate to the world? And now I'm going to talk about God simply as the generic word to refer to the image of God as we see especially in the Torah. So here we need to talk about the God of the philosophers. We're going to first discuss what this God is not. The God of the philosophers. So the God of philosophers can be described with all these polysyllabic words. Omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient. Okay, the words, when you see the words on paper, the meaning is pretty clear. And then without a body. Trying to find a fancy word for that, but how do you say, acorporeal? Is that a word? Incorporeal. Yes, incorporeal. Right, good. Incorporeal, without a body. That's what the philosophers say. Classic example in Judaism, a philosopher, of course, is Maimonides, right? 12th century philosopher active in Egypt. I think we mentioned Maimonides a couple of times already. So this is the God of, we might say, of educated Jews and Christians for the last couple millennia. Is this God, or this conception of God? God omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient, incorporeal. Philosophers then immediately have a problem if you define God in these abstract ways. Inevitably this is abstract, especially if God does not have a body. It is very hard for any of us humans to conceive of this God. I mean, draw a mental picture of something which doesn't have a body. You'll have a problem. So, philosophers, of course, have this abstract God, and the philosophers now have the problem, how does this abstract God relate to the world? How do you pray to such a God? How do you cozy up to such a God? Right? How do you establish spiritual intimacy with such a God? Answer, very difficult. But that's the philosophers. I want to ask, in this book, the Hebrew Bible, in general, or the Torah in particular, is that the God that we find? And the answer is, in short, the answer is no. And here I put in italics on my handout, just to be absolutely sure that you don't miss it. Not clear whether this conception of God can be found anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. And I would say, I would probably leave out the qualifier. I don't think you can find that conception of God anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible was not written by philosophers. Or maybe they passed for philosophers in their own time and place, but in retrospect, we would not call their conceptions of God philosophical. What do you have instead? As we've already seen in the narratives, especially in the book of Genesis, especially in the book of Exodus, in these narratives, God is anthropomorphic, meaning God has the shape, a morph, right? God has the shape of human. God is anthropopathic. God has the pathe of humans, passions, the emotions of humans. And God apparently has a body. Outstretched arm, God walks, God talks. If God speaks, one assumes God has a mouth. God sees, God gets angry, God repents, changes his mind, God has mercy. These are human emotions, which are routinely ascribed to God. And then, of course, you might have a simple case where Abraham is sitting in his tent one day and lifts up his eyes and he sees God standing there. Needless to say, these conceptions will bother later philosophers a great deal, both Jews and Christians alike. How philosophically unrespectable these passages are, how simplistic, naive, ill-tutored, uneducated they appear to be. Because we know, quote unquote, that God really isn't like that. However, if you read this passages straight, well, God is like that. Especially in the stories of Genesis and Exodus, especially in the hands of the narrator we call Jay. So Cohen talks about this in the chapter in the book, and he calls this the God of old. The God of old. This old-time conceptions of God, in which God is very much a human being with human emotions, human limbs, etc., right? In which God is depicted in this very anthropomorphic manner. This is the God of old. And he connects it with angels, and there I confess Cohen confuses me a great deal, where he says that in this conception of God, when you see God, God appears to you. Another way to say that God appears to you is to say you saw an angel. Now, once you mention angels, now we're really in the thick of it, because it gets very, very messy very quickly. So angels certainly can be a manifestation of the God of old, namely the God who manifests himself walking down the street. So you lift up your eyes and you see an angel. Another way of saying you saw God. But insofar as God is manifest and visible, we call that an angel. How an angel relates to God, if you read the narratives very carefully, is extraordinarily confusing. And my two favorite examples are Genesis chapter 18 and Genesis chapter 32, where the narrator seems to jump back and forth. Is Abraham talking to God, or is Abraham talking to an angel? Did Abraham see God, or did Abraham see an angel? I don't know, but the passage is jumping around, and I can't tell. It's quite hard to figure out. So for Kugel, the angel passages are evidence of the God of old, right? The anthropomorphic God who communicates directly in an unintermediated way with humans. However, later philosopher types looked on the references to angels, and they saw that as evidence not for the God of old, but what I would call the God of new. Namely, you can't see God because God is precisely not anthropomorphic. God does not have a body, as we philosophers have been saying all along. So when you think you see God, what are you actually seeing? Answer, you're seeing some kind of mysterious intermediary by which God makes himself manifest to you. And we're going to call that an angel. We can call that other things too. We can call that Christ, if we're Christians. We can call that Logos, if we're philosophically minded Jews as well as Christians. We can call it all kinds of things. But these intermediary beings are there precisely because we believe in God as a non-anthropomorphic, incorporeal being. That's why we need angels there to intermediate. So I'm very confused reading Kugel whether the angels are evidence of the God of old or the angels are evidence of the God of new. Where are we in this process? And I respectfully would say this is not one of Kugel's more successful conceptions, in my opinion, unless I misconstrued and misunderstood his whole point, in which case I apologize to him, and then someone please enlighten me on what he is saying. If you're interested in this, I have a very nice session on this in my next term in CB23, and the argument between Justin Martyr and the Jew, right, trying to understand Genesis 18. Genesis 18 is a stunning chapter. Right? Abraham is sitting by his tent. Sorry, the Lord appears to Abraham, verse 1. Verse 2, Abraham lifts his eyes and sees three men. Okay, go to work. Explain that. Yeah. Right. And then we discover these three men are really angels, but they're also the Lord. Yeah, so this provides an occasion for the Jew and the Christian to argue how to interpret this. And of course, for Justin, when it says Lord, it means Christ. Because no one lifts up his eyes and sees God. God's incorporeal. God does not manifest himself that way. That's for Greek mythology. That's not really what God is. Anyway, it's a wonderful, wonderful passage. The Torah's unphilosophical conception of God, you can see also in a point which I raised very briefly last week, which is when we try to talk about who or what is in the temple, or who or what is in this tabernacle, that portable tent shrine the Israelites have in the wilderness. So, class, is God to be found in the temple? Is God to be found in the tabernacle? Well, if you're a philosopher, of course, you know the answer is, of course not. That's stupid. You think this omnipotent, omniscient, universal God can be somehow put into a box? That makes no sense. However, if you're one of the writers of the Torah, apparently the answer is, yeah. God is somehow in the temple. There are different sources, have different conceptions at this point. Whether it's God himself, this is the house of the Lord, God, or the divine throne, the divine footstool. We've already seen those conceptions in connection with P. And how do we know that God is really there, quote unquote? Because there's a pillar of smoke and or a pillar of fire. So when I see that, I know, quote, God is there. And when the pillar of cloud or smoke rises up and moves, then I know it's time to move on. That's P. Now, I'm thoroughly confused by this because P is also the same guy who gives us Genesis chapter 1, which is the most cosmic God of all. I mean, you can't get more cosmic than the God of Genesis chapter 1, who creates the cosmos. and apparently is all alone doing so. Well, at least until you get to verse 26 and he creates humans, then we have this mysterious plural. But okay, at least until then, he's all by himself. And yet P is the same guy who also seems to tell that God is represented by a pillar of cloud or a pillar of smoke and moves into the tabernacle. And that's how we know God is there, and Moses can't enter when the cloud is there, because God is there. Which seems a very, dare I say it, naive conception. Okay, but we have an interesting problem here. When we get to Deuteronomy, it gets even more interesting, because Deuteronomy routinely uses the phrase, the place where God has chosen his name to dwell. So it's not God in the temple, shrine, it's God's name in the temple or shrine. Now, was Deuteronomy already getting a little bit more sophisticated? Deuteronomy is getting worried about this problem. How can I contain a universal God in a small building? So my answer is, no, it's not God, it's God's name. God himself is too big to be put into a building. Is that how I should read it? That's how later Jews read it, to be sure. Whether that's what Deuteronomy really had in mind, I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, I have to kind of move on because I've got to the last big point. I can't run out of time. In short, I would simply say all of this is evidence that the people who wrote the Torah were not Aristotelian philosophers. When they conceived of God, they did not conceive of God as idea, capital I, or as mind, capital M, or as prime mover, capital P, capital M. All those philosophical, or the mind of the universe, the soul of the universe, right? All those philosophical conceptions are wonderful, right? But they clearly are not the conceptions of God that animate this text. And this will bother later Jews and Christians who will have to go back and clean up the Torah. It's all metaphor, it's all symbol, it's all God, the Torah speaking normal language for the benefit of the ill-educated. But we know it's not really so. Okay. Last big point. Is the God of the Torah a God of vengeance, God of war, God of anger? Question mark. Or to put the question in its true form, is the God of the Old Testament a God of vengeance as opposed to the God of the New Testament who is a God of love? I'm sure you've heard this. Is this so? Most I need to say up front, this contrast, the God of the stern God of the Old Testament, I'm using now that language deliberately, the stern God of the Old Testament, the God of vengeance, war, strict, just, etc., versus the loving God of the New Testament, that contrast is ancient. It goes back at least to the 2nd century CE with a Christian heretic named Marcion, whom I'll talk more about next term in my CB 23 class. Marcion, M-A-R-C-I-O-N, Marcion, right, who said precisely that the God of the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, is not the Christian God. Because we worship the God of the New Testament, that's the God of love, a good God. Whereas the God of the Hebrew Bible is a bad God. He's mean. He's not nice. That's not the God we worship. We have two separate gods. That's Marcion. Later Christians said, that's heretical. You cannot believe that and still be a good Christian. It's the same God. It's all one and the same God. All right, but interesting to observe in Christian popular culture and popular perception of the Bible, I have to say Marcion, I would observe, has won. Because everybody knows that the God of the Hebrew Bible is this strict, stern God of vengeance and war, and the God of the New Testament is the God of love. So is this so? So I don't have time to talk about the New Testament God right now. That's not my job. I hope to do that in my biblical literacy class next year if it's approved by the powers that be. Anyway, I would simply observe, I gave you a bunch of passages on the handout. If you read those passages, I would challenge you to read any of them and think that this God is a God of love, or alone. The God of love stuff comes out of 1 Corinthians. It comes out of a passage in Paul, who does indeed in that chapter conceive of God as love, capital L. However, the picture as a whole is far more complicated, as you would imagine in any large religious text. Similarly, my point here also is the God of the Hebrew Bible, which is my concern here, right? It's a complicated legacy. It can't be reduced to such simplistic summaries in spite of what you've been told. But I need to admit up front, the God of the Hebrew Bible gets a bad press. There's a lot of stuff in there which needs explaining. He punishes humanity with death as a response to the sin of the Garden of Eden. At least that's how Christians understand the story. He destroys the world in the flood. He destroys Sodom and Gomorrah because they are sinful. He kills all the Egyptian firstborns. He threatens to destroy the Israelites in the wilderness. Then we have this lex talionis, the law of vengeance. Then we have this God is warrior in Exodus 15. So we've got some tough press. I admit it. Don't deny it. But at the end of the day, is that the whole picture? Of course the answer is no, and it can't be. Right? The Hebrew Bible in general and the Torah in particular are rich and variegated documents. They're going to have numerous different conceptions at work, and no doubt these you have on the one side the strict, stern judge on the one side, to be sure, but on the other side you've got other images as well. I don't have time to deal with all of this issue. I was going to simply observe that many of these cases we are imposing our own cultural norms on the Hebrew text. And this was most clearly, I was going to talk about visiting the sins of the parents on the children. Visiting the sins of the parents on the children. This is a motif in a number of passages. Visiting the sins of the parents on the children. So the children pay for the sins committed by the parents. Is that fair? And yet I would say from the point of view of the Torah at least of some strata in the Torah, the answer is yes. Not only is it fair and right, it's mercy. It's not divine, it's not divine justice. It's divine mercy at work. Why is it mercy? I'll tell you why it's mercy. In brief, when you buy a house, do you want to pay $200,000 up front in cash, or do you want to take a 30-year mortgage? That's a no-brainer. You want to take a 30-year mortgage. 30 years from now, maybe your children are going to inherit your debt. No, you understand. We understand. It's better to pay off over 30 years than to pay up front. Nobody wants to pay it up front in one lump sum. Everybody wants it to spread out over time. Well, it's exactly the same thing. I did a sin. I owe God punishment. I don't want to pay it up front. I want to take it over 30 years. Your children are going to inherit it? That's all right. It'll work out. That's divine mercy. And for us to come along and to say, from our perspective, it's not mercy at all, it seems to us completely unfair, okay, fine, you're entitled to your perspective. That's not the perspective of the text. The text is part of a conception at work of God as merciful. And in the lecture handout, I give you the main passages to look at to see that. So I'm just trying to observe two things. One is the record is actually quite variegated and complicated. And two, we need to interpret the text from within, from how the texts themselves present these points, and not simply come along and impose our values on the text. Okay, ran out of time there, but okay, have a great weekend, everyone. Enjoy the beautiful New England weather, and look forward to seeing you on Monday when we'll talk about Joshua and the conquest of Canaan. Thank you all.